Chevalier d'Eon was a decorated dragoon captain and one of the deadliest swordsmen in France. Yet he was also a noblewoman who charmed the Queen of England, a warrior on the battlefield, a lady in the palace. How could one person be both? This isn't a myth. This is the true story of the 18th century's most famous spy, a man who lived half his life as a woman, not because he wanted to, but because the King of France forced him to. And when he died, the autopsy shocked the world. The story begins in Tonnerre, a small sun-drenched town in the Burgundy region of France, famous for its deep sinkhole spring, the Fosse d'Eon, a place steeped in ancient legends. It was here, on October 5th, 1728, that Charles d'Eon was born. The d'Eon family was of the nobility, but it is important to understand exactly what that meant. They were not the Versailles elite draped in gold and indifference. They were the petite noblesse, proud provincial aristocracy with a coat of arms on the wall and mounting debts on the table. His father, Louis d'Eon, was a lawyer, a director of the king's domains, a man of the robe who scraped by to maintain the appearance of aristocracy. From the very moment of his birth, ambiguity clung to Charles like a second skin. He was born with a caul, a thin membrane of the amniotic sac covering his head. In the folklore of the French countryside, this was a powerful omen. It signified that the child was destined for greatness, perhaps for the priesthood, or that they possessed the second sight. But it also marked the child as other, someone who arrived in the world veiled, separated from reality by a thin, shimmering curtain. He was given a string of names: Charles, Geneviève, Louis, Auguste, André, Timothée. It was customary to honor various godparents and saints, but notice the inclusion of Geneviève, a female name. While not entirely unheard of for boys in Catholic France to have a female saint's name as a middle name, it would later become a significant detail in d'Eon's own mythology. Growing up in Tonnerre, the young Charles was a paradox. He was a boy, legally and socially, yet he was strikingly beautiful in a way that was often described as feminine. He was slight of build, with delicate bone structure, a porcelain complexion, and a voice that refused to deepen even as he entered adolescence. He had no need to shave. In his later memoirs, which must always be read with a grain of salt, for d'Eon was a storyteller as much as a spy, he claimed that, as a child, his mother often dressed him in girl's clothing, treating him as the daughter she had desired. Whether this was true or a retroactive justification for his later life, we do not know, but we do know that he was bullied. The rougher boys of the province mocked his pretty face and his soft hands, but d'Eon's reaction to this mockery established a pattern that would define his entire adult life. He compensated with ferocious, undeniable competence. If they mocked him for looking like a girl, he would outsmart them like a sage and outfight them like a gladiator. He threw himself into his education with a terrifying intensity. In 1749, he moved to Paris to attend the prestigious Collège Mazarin. Paris, in the mid-18th century, was the intellectual capital of the world, the beating heart of the Enlightenment. It was a city of philosophers, scientists, libertines, and spies. Young d'Eon fit right in. He graduated as a doctor of civil and canon law, a massive achievement for a young man in his early 20s. He didn't stop there. He became a censor for the king, a powerful bureaucratic role that involved reading manuscripts to decide if they were fit for publication. This gave him access to the cutting edge of political and philosophical thought. He wrote books on finance and government administration that were so astute they drew the attention of the royal court. But while his mind was conquering the salons of Paris, his body was mastering the fencing academies. d'Eon realized early on that in a society obsessed with masculine honor, the sword was the ultimate equalizer. he trained relentlessly. The small pretty boy from Burgundy became one of the most lethal swordsmen in France. It was a jarring contrast. To see Déon in a parlor, you saw a petite, almost fragile figure with a soft voice. To see him with a foil in his hand was to see a viper striking. This duality, the scholar and the soldier, the feminine appearance and the masculine aggression, made him fascinating to the elite. He was unthreatening in appearance, yet incredibly useful in practice. And usefulness was exactly what King Louis XV was desperate for. To understand the twist of fate that turned a lawyer into a spy, we must look at the peculiar political madness of France at this time. Louis XV was a strange monarch. He was intelligent, but pathologically indecisive and deeply suspicious of his own ministers. He created a system of government that historians call le secret du roi, the king's secret. Imagine a government within a government. On the surface, you had the foreign minister and the official ambassadors conducting diplomacy in the daylight. But underneath, operating in the shadows, was a network of secret agents who reported directly to the king, often with orders that completely contradicted the official policy. They were the king's private eyes and ears, a secret service designed to pursue Louis's personal dynastic ambitions, particularly in Eastern Europe. The head of this secret network was the Prince de Conti, a high-ranking cousin of the king. Conti was looking for a specific type of agent. He needed someone intelligent enough to understand complex treaties, loyal enough to keep secrets that could get them executed, and most importantly, someone who could blend in. It was around 1755 that Déon came to Conti's attention. The story of his recruitment is the stuff of legend. It is said that Déon was at a masked ball, perhaps dressed as a woman, a common amusement at the time, or simply displaying his usual wit in a salon. Conti saw something in the young lawyer. He saw a blank canvas. He saw someone who could be anyone. The mission Conti proposed was bordering on suicidal. France was desperate to encircle its rival, Prussia, and to do that, they needed an alliance with Russia. But diplomatic relations between France and Russia were frozen. The Empress Elizabeth of Russia was a volatile, passionate, and difficult ruler who had banned French envoys from her court. She was surrounded by advisors who were on the payroll of the British and the Prussians, enemies of France. If a French diplomat showed up at the border with official papers, he would be turned back or arrested. The king needed a messenger who could slip past the border guards, bypass the British spies in St. Petersburg, and get a personal letter directly into the hands of Empress Elizabeth. A man could not do it. A soldier could not do it. According to Déon's later memoirs, he did not just travel with a woman's disguise in his luggage. He traveled as the woman. He claimed that his slight build and lack of facial hair allowed him to pass perfectly as Douglas's niece. They endured a brutal journey across the frozen landscape of northern Europe, carriages rattling over ice-rutted roads, staying in inns where a single slip of the voice or a careless gesture could reveal their identity. When they arrived in St. Petersburg, the court of Empress Elizabeth was a place of decadent luxury and vicious intrigue. It was a world of fur, diamonds, vodka, and poison. Leah de Beaumont was introduced to society. The niece was charming, modest, and spoke excellent French, the language of the Russian elite. Déon played the part of the innocent, well-read young lady to perfection. The brilliance of the disguise was that in the 18th century, women were often dismissed as political non-combatants. The British spies and Prussian agents watching the court ignored the shy French girl standing in the corner. Who would suspect her? This allowed Leah to move through the palace with an invisibility that a male diplomat could only dream of. The legend says that Leah became a favorite of Empress Elizabeth. She was invited into the Empress's private chambers. While the Empress dressed or had her hair done, Leah would read aloud to her from French novels and philosophy. And in between the chapters of Montesquieu or Voltaire, Leah would whisper words from Louis XV. She would slip the secret letters, hidden in the binding of a book or the hollow of a false heel, directly to the ruler of Russia. Whether Deon spent the entirety of this first mission in drag is a matter of historical debate. Some evidence suggests he switched between male and female personas depending on who he was meeting, but the result is undisputed. The mission was a spectacular success. The ice between France and Russia was broken. The British ambassador was completely outmaneuvered, unaware that the pretty girl he had ignored was actually a French master spy orchestrating his downfall. Deon returned to Versailles not just as a successful agent, but as a hero of the secret. He had proven his loyalty and his uncanny ability to navigate the treacherous waters of identity. But the game was about to change. War was coming. The 7 Years' War, the first true world war in history. And Deon would soon have to trade his silk dresses for the uniform of a dragoon captain. The female diplomat was about to vanish, and the warrior was about to take the stage, proving that his sword was just as sharp as his wit. However, the transition back to masculinity would not be as simple as changing clothes. The psychological seed had been planted. Deon had lived as a woman, been treated as a woman, and found that he excelled at it. He had tasted a different kind of power, the power of the overlooked, the power of the feminine mystique. As he strapped on his sword to ride into battle against the Prussians, part of Leah remained within him, waiting for the moment to reemerge. The war that followed would test Deon in ways he could not imagine. It would take him from the frozen palaces of Russia to the muddy, blood-soaked fields of Germany. It would earn him the Cross of St. Louis, the highest honor a French soldier could hope for. But it would also set him on a collision course with his own government, a path that would lead to blackmail, exile, and the eventual shattering of his identity. As the drums of war began to beat across Europe in 1756, Deon prepared to ride out, leaving the soft, perfumed air of the Russian court for the smell of gunpowder and horse sweat. He was young, he was brilliant, and he was the king's favorite secret weapon. But in the shadows of the French court, jealous eyes were already watching. The higher Deon rose, the more dangerous his position became. He was a man who knew too much, a man who could be anyone, and for the rigid hierarchy of the French nobility that made him a threat that would eventually need to be neutralized. The year was 1756, and Europe was setting itself on fire. The 7 Years' War had begun, a conflict so vast it would spill over into the Americas, India, and the Philippines, reshaping the global map. For Charles Deon, this was the moment to lay aside the silk fans of the Russian court and unsheathe the saber of a French soldier. He was 28 years old, and he was about to trade the subtle whispers of diplomacy for the deafening roar of the cannon. It is a testament to Deon's extraordinary versatility that he transitioned so seamlessly from Leah de Beaumont, the demure niece in St. Petersburg, to Captain Deon of the Dragoons. The Dragoons were heavy cavalry, the hammer of the French army. They were men of grit and violence, expected to ride into the thickest fighting, dismount to fire muskets, or charge with swords drawn. Deon, with his slight frame and effeminate features, might have seemed out of place among these hardened killers, but he possessed a ferocity that stunned his subordinates. In August 1761, at the Battle of Willinghausen in western Germany, the mettle of the spy-turned-soldier was tested in blood. The French forces were facing a combined army of British, Hanoverian, and Prussian troops. The fighting was brutal, a chaotic melee of smoke, screaming horses, and bayonets. D'Eon was not in the rear with the generals, he was at the front. During a desperate charge, he found himself responsible for an ammunition convoy under heavy fire. While others panicked, D'Eon rallied his men, driving them through the hail of bullets to deliver the powder. Later in the same campaign, at the engagement of Ultrop, D'Eon led a charge against a battalion of Scottish Highlanders. He was wounded in the head and the thigh, his uniform soaked in blood, yet he refused to leave the field until the objective was taken. This was the masculine peak of his life. He was living the ideal of the 18th century nobleman, brave, reckless, and serving his king with his body. When he returned to Versailles in 1763, he was a celebrity. He was limping, he was scarred, and he was triumphant. King Louis XV, recognizing both the military heroism and the secret success in Russia, awarded him the Order of Saint Louis. This was a pivotal moment. The Cross of Saint Louis was the holy grail for a French officer. It conferred the title of Chevalier. From this moment on, he was no longer just Charles. He was the Chevalier d'Eon. It was a title that validated his manhood, his honor, and his status. He wore the small red ribbon of the order on his chest every day for the rest of his life, even decades later, when that chest was covered by a woman's bodice. But the war was ending. France had lost, and lost badly. The treasury was empty, the navy was decimated, and the colonies in Canada were gone. The king needed a diplomat who could navigate the humiliation of defeat and salvage a peace treaty with the victorious British. Who better than the hero of Willinghausen, the man who had charmed the Russians? In 1762, D'Eon was sent to London as part of the peace delegation. He was appointed secretary to the ambassador, the Duc de Nivernais. Nivernais was a grand old aristocrat, lazy but intelligent, and he quickly realized that D'Eon was the only one in the embassy who actually wanted to do any work. While the Duke slept or socialized, D'Eon worked 18-hour days, drafting the complex articles of the Treaty of Paris. When the treaty was finally signed in 1763, ending the war, it was D'Eon who was given the honor of carrying the ratified documents back to Versailles. He rode non-stop, breaking speed records, fueled by adrenaline and ambition. The king was delighted. He promoted D'Eon to minister plenipotentiary, essentially an interim ambassador, to the court of St. James in London. This was the zenith of D'Eon's career. He returned to London not as a servant, but as the representative of France. He took up residence in a grand house in Soho. He imported hundreds of bottles of his beloved Burgundy wine. He threw lavish dinner parties where he charmed the British aristocracy with his wit, his war stories, and his intellect. He even became a favorite of King George III. The British loved a character, and this small, feisty Frenchman who wrote books and fought duels was the toast of the town. But beneath the champagne and the diplomatic balls, a dark current was swirling. Louis XV, ever the duplicitous monarch, had not given up on revenge. While his official government signed a peace treaty pledging friendship with England, his secret government, Le Secret du Roi, was planning an invasion. D'Eon received new top-secret orders from the king's personal hand. He was to use his time in London to survey the British coast. He was to identify landing zones for French troops. He was to map the defenses of London. He was to prepare for the day when French soldiers would burn the British capital. It was high treason. If the British government found out, D'Eon would be hanged. If the official French ministers found out, D'Eon would be thrown in the Bastille for endangering the peace. He was walking a tightrope over a pit of vipers, holding the king's most dangerous secrets in a hidden compartment of his desk. And then the villain of our story arrived. His name was the Comte de Guerchy. He was appointed as the new permanent ambassador to London, replacing the interim D'Eon. Guerchy was everything D'Eon was not. He was immensely wealthy. He came from one of the oldest families in France, and he was, by all accounts, profoundly incompetent. He had no experience in diplomacy. He was a man of the court, a sycophant, who believed his title entitled him to respect he hadn't earned. The conflict was instant and chemical. D'Eon, the brilliant, self-made meritocrat, who had actually written the peace treaty, looked at Guerchy with disdain. Guerchy, sensing D'Eon's intellectual superiority, looked at the little Chevalier with jealousy and fear. It started with petty slights. Guerchy criticized D'Eon's spending. He questioned his accounting. He treated the hero of Villinghausen like a common clerk. D'Eon, whose pride was as sharp as his sword, fired back. He refused to back down. He wrote scathing letters to Versailles, mocking Guerchy's stupidity. He famously said that a man of talent serving a fool is like a spirited horse harnessed to a cart of manure. The atmosphere in the French embassy in London turned toxic. It was a civil war fought with quills and etiquette. But Guerchy had the one thing D'Eon lacked: powerful friends. Guerchy was connected to the king's ministers. He began to poison the well in Versailles. He painted D'Eon as a loose cannon, a madman, a spendthrift who was embarrassing France. The blow fell in late 1763. A letter arrived from the foreign minister in Versailles. It was a brutal demotion. D'Eon was stripped of his rank as minister plenipotentiary. He was ordered to pack his bags, leave London immediately, and return to Paris to face an inquiry. D'Eon froze. He knew what return to Paris meant. It meant the Bastille. It meant a dark cell where the king's secrets would be buried along with the man who held them. He knew that Guerchy had likely arranged for him to be kidnapped or silenced on the journey home. It was a moment of existential terror. The entire apparatus of the French state, the most powerful absolute monarchy in Europe, was turning its gaze upon him to crush him. He was one man against a king. He should have submitted. He should have bowed his head and accepted his fate. But Charles D'Eon did not submit. In a move that stunned the diplomatic world, D'Eon refused the order. He barricaded himself in his house on Brewer Street in Soho. He declared that he would not return to France. He claimed that the order was a forgery, a trick by Guerchy. And then he played his ace. He wrote a letter to the king, but this was not a plea for mercy. It was a threat. He reminded Louis XV that sitting in his safe in London were the secret invasion plans. He had the surveys, the maps, and the king's own handwritten letters authorizing a sneak attack on England. "If you touch me," D'Eon essentially said, "if you stop my pension, if you try to arrest me, I will hand these papers to the British Prime Minister. I will start a war that will destroy France." It was the ultimate blackmail. The secret du roi had been turned against the king. Louis XV was trapped. He couldn't arrest D'Eon without risking exposure. He couldn't kill D'Eon because the papers were hidden with friends, ready to be released in the event of his death. The standoff began. D'Eon was now a renegade, an exile in London. He was stripped of his official diplomatic status, but he held the power of a kingmaker. He began to publish pamphlets attacking Guerchy, exposing the ambassador's incompetence to the British public. The Londoners, who hated the arrogant French aristocracy but loved a plucky underdog, cheered him on. D'Eon became a sensation. Mobs would gather outside his house to shout liberty when he appeared, but the pressure was immense. D'Eon was paranoid. He slept with pistols by his bed. He believed Guerchy had hired assassins to poison his wine or stab him in a dark alley. He had the chimneys of his house barred so no one could climb down. He only ate food prepared by his most trusted servants. It was in this cauldron of stress, paranoia, and public scrutiny that the Chevalier's behavior began to change. The madness that Guerchy had whispered about seemed to be manifesting, but in a way no one expected. D'Eon stopped leaving his house as often. When he did, he wore heavy coats, hiding his figure. He began to hint to his few remaining friends that he was not what he seemed. He dropped cryptic remarks about the burden of masculinity. He wrote vague, sorrowful entries in his diary about the misfortune of his condition. And the rumors began. It started as a whisper in the clubs of St. James. Why does the Chevalier have no wife? Why is his voice so high? Have you noticed how smooth his chin is? Why did he refuse to duel that British officer last week? Then, a darker, more sensational rumor took hold. It wasn't just that he was effeminate. It was that he was literally a woman. The logic of the gossip went like this. How could a mere man defy the King of France so boldly? He must have some special protection. Maybe he was the king's former mistress. Maybe he was a woman who had been forced to disguise herself to save the family honor. D'Eon heard these rumors, and instead of silencing them, instead of challenging the gossipers to a duel, as he would have done a few years prior, he did something masterful. He stayed silent. He smiled. He let the ambiguity grow. He realized that this confusion was a weapon. If the French government thought he was a woman, they might be more lenient. If the British public thought he was a woman, they would be even more protective of him against the bullying Comte de Guerchy. The female Chevalier narrative began to take root. While all of London whispered and stared, D'Eon sat in his fortress in Soho, clutching the king's secrets. He realized that the only way to survive might be to kill Charles d'Eon and let someone else take his place. By the early 1770s, London had become a carnival, and the Chevalier d'Eon was its main attraction. The city, always hungry for scandal, had latched on to the great question of the Chevalier's sex with a fervor that bordered on madness. It is difficult for us in the modern age to comprehend the sheer scale of this obsession. It wasn't just idle gossip, it was a financial market. Gambling was the vice of the Georgian era, and the policies, betting slips on d'Eon's gender, were trading on the London Stock Exchange alongside shares of the East India Company. The odds shifted daily. If d'Eon wore a particularly fitted coat, the odds on male went up. If he was seen weeping at the opera, the odds on female skyrocketed. It is estimated that over £120,000 was wagered, an astronomical sum that would be worth tens of millions of dollars today. D'Eon was living in a fortress on Brewer Street under a state of siege. Every time he stepped out the door, he was mobbed. People tried to lift his coattails. Sketch artists from the tabloid press followed him, trying to capture a glimpse of a curve or a bulge that would give away the game. There were darker attempts too. Several bold gamblers tried to bribe his barber to save the hair clippings, hoping to analyze the texture. Others offered small fortunes to his servants to drill holes in the walls of his bathroom. Imagine the psychological toll of this existence. D'Eon was a proud soldier, a man who had led cavalry charges, now reduced to a specimen in a zoo. He responded with flashes of his old violent temper. When two bankers approached him in a coffee house to ask him pertinent questions, D'Eon threatened to cane them within an inch of their lives. But he never issued a formal denial. He realized that as long as the doubt existed, he was safe. The French government was paralyzed by the confusion. They couldn't very well kidnap a potential woman and throw her in a dungeon without provoking a moral outrage across Europe. But the stalemate could not last forever. In 1774, The tectonic plates of history shifted. King Louis XV, the architect of the secret, died of smallpox. His grandson, Louis XVI, ascended the throne. The new king was young, pious, and desperate to clean up the mess his grandfather had left behind. He wanted to dissolve the spy network. He wanted normal relations with England. And most of all, he wanted those blackmail documents, the invasion plans, back in French hands immediately. To solve the Dion problem, the king sent a new negotiator to London. And in a stroke of historical irony, the man he chose was perhaps the only person in France as dramatic and theatrical as D'Eon himself, Pierre Beaumarchais. Beaumarchais is best known to history as the playwright who wrote The Barber of Seville and The Marriage of Figaro. But he was also a watchmaker, an arms dealer, and a spy. He loved a complex plot, and he looked at D'Eon not as a traitor, but as a fascinating character in a grand play. The meeting between these two in D'Eon's cluttered London apartment must have been electric. Beaumarchais expected to find a rogue soldier. Instead, he found a weeping, vulnerable figure who confessed a terrible secret. Here, D'Eon made the move that would seal his fate. He looked Beaumarchais in the eye and lied, or perhaps revealed a truth he had decided to inhabit. He told the playwright that he was, in fact, a woman. He spun a tragic tale. He had been born female, but his father, desperate for a male heir to inherit the family estate, had raised him as a boy. He claimed that his entire life, the army, the fencing, the diplomacy, had been an exhausting performance forced upon him by duty to his family and his king. He showed Beaumarchais his scars from the war and wept, asking, "What woman has ever suffered for her country as I have?" Beaumarchais, the master of fiction, was completely taken in. He wrote back to Louis XVI, describing D'Eon as a lioness, a virtuous Amazon who had suppressed her gentle female nature to serve the state. When I think that this creature, so persecuted, belongs to a sex which requires everything to be forgiven, Beaumarchais wrote, my heart breaks. The king was convinced. The narrative fit perfectly. It explained everything. It explained the high voice, the lack of beard, the rumors, and it gave the king a way to solve the blackmail problem without looking weak. He wasn't yielding to a traitor. He was protecting a damsel in distress. A deal was struck. It was formalized in a document known as the transaction. The terms were specific and life-altering. D'Eon would hand over the invasion plans and the secret correspondence. In return, he would receive a generous royal pension and permission to return to France. But there was a condition, a covenant that D'Eon had to sign. The king decreed that since D'Eon was now officially recognized as a woman, the masquerade must end. For the sake of public morality and the dignity of the crown, D'Eon was forbidden from ever wearing male clothing again. He, now she, must adopt the dress of her sex and keep it until death. D'Eon signed. He sold his dragoon uniform. He packed away the red coat that had seen the smoke of battle. And then the shopping began. It is a scene of tragic comedy. The Chevalier D'Eon, nearly 50 years old, weather-beaten and muscular, standing in London shops buying corsets, petticoats, and lace caps. He grumbled about the expense. He complained about the impracticality. He wrote to friends that he was preparing for his political death. In 1777, the Chevalier D'Eon arrived back in France. The news had preceded him. The entire country was holding its breath. As his carriage rolled into Versailles, crowds lined the streets. They didn't cheer. They stared. They wanted to see the Amazon. D'Eon's first appearance at court was a disaster of awkwardness. He arrived still wearing his dragoon uniform, claiming he didn't have a dress ready yet. The reaction was frosty. The foreign minister, the Comte de Vergennes, told him bluntly, "Mademoiselle, you have orders. Go and change." The queen, Marie Antoinette, intervened. She was fascinated by D'Eon. She offered to pay for his new wardrobe and sent her own personal dressmaker, the famous Rose Bertin, to outfit the former spy. This was not a kindness. It was a remodeling. Rose Bertin was an artist, but her medium was whalebone and silk. She took the Chevalier's body, a body hardened by decades of riding horses and fencing, and forced it into the fashionable silhouette of the late 18th century. Imagine the physical sensation. For 50 years, D'Eon had moved with the swagger of a soldier. His legs were used to striding, his chest used to expanding with deep breaths. Now, he was laced into a corset so tight it restricted his breathing. His legs were buried under layers of heavy fabric that tangled around his ankles. His head, usually covered by a simple wig or a tricorn hat, was piled high with powdered hair and ornaments that made it difficult to balance. When Mademoiselle D'Eon was finally presented to the court, teetering on high heels, the courtiers did not applaud. They laughed. It was a cruel, tittering laughter that echoed through the hall of mirrors. They mocked his 5 o'clock shadow, which required heavy makeup to hide. They mocked his stride, which was too long and aggressive for a lady. They mocked the way he sat, legs apart, hands on his knees, forgetting the modest posture required of women. D'Eon later wrote of this period with intense bitterness. "I am a lion," he wrote, "but they have shaved my mane and filed my claws." He had thought that becoming a woman would bring him peace and safety. Instead, he found that he had traded one prison for another. As a man, he had been a renegade, a danger to the state. As a woman, he was expected to be silent, decorative, and passive. The politicians who had once feared his intellect now dismissed him as a gossiping old lady. The generals who had respected his courage now treated him as a novelty act. He tried to maintain his dignity. He insisted on wearing the Croix de Saint-Louis, his military medal, pinned to his evening gown. It was a jarring visual symbol, the ribbon of a warrior on the breast of a spinster. It was a defiant scream that said, "I am still the hero of Willinghausen, no matter what I am wearing." But the novelty wore off quickly. The court grew bored of the bearded lady. The king, having got his papers back, lost interest. D'Eon was exiled again, not to a foreign country, but to his family estate in Tonnerre. He was ordered to live quietly with his aging mother and act like a proper woman. For several years, D'Eon lived a life of suffocating boredom. He attended church. He did needlepoint. He wrote letters that went unanswered. He was trapped in the identity he had crafted. The lie, if it was a lie, had become his cage. But history was not done with the Chevalier. The world outside Tonnerre was darkening. The Enlightenment was giving way to revolution. And across the Channel, England was beckoning again. D'Eon began to plot his return to London. He told the government he needed to go back to settle his debts and retrieve his library. In 1785, permission was granted. Mademoiselle D'Eon crossed the Channel once more. She likely thought she was going for a short trip, a final bow on the stage of her former glory. She did not know that she would never see France again. She did not know that the curtain was about to rise on the final, most desperate, and most heroic act of her life, an act where an old woman would pick up a sword and prove that gender might be a performance, but courage is a fact. When Mademoiselle D'Eon stepped off the boat in Dover in 1785, returning to English soil, she was greeted not as a diplomat, but as a living legend. To the British public, she was no longer the dangerous spy who had threatened their coastline. She was the old Amazon, a figure of immense curiosity and grudging respect. She was 57 years old, her face lined with the stress of her double life, her body growing heavy under the sedentary constraints of her attire. Yet, the moment she breathed the smoky air of London, Something in her spirit seemed to unlock. She took up residence near the Strand, and for a brief, glittering moment it seemed as though the glory days had returned. The London press, always hungry for a character, devoured her. They reported on her dinner parties, her wit, and her surprisingly aggressive opinions on politics. But beneath the social swirling, D'Eon faced a brutal reality. She was broke. The generous pension promised by Louis XVI was often late or incomplete, and D'Eon's lifestyle, filled with rare books and fine wines, was expensive. To survive, the Chevalier realized she had to do the one thing a noblewoman was never supposed to do. She had to put herself on display. She had to turn her life into a performance. The culmination of this desperate need for money and relevance took place on April 9th, 1787 at Carlton House, the palatial residence of the Prince of Wales. It remains one of the most surreal spectacles in sporting history. The event was a fencing exhibition. The combatants, on one side, the Chevalier de Saint-Georges, a mixed-race fencing master known as the Black Mozart, a man in the prime of his youth, athletic, tall, and widely considered the finest swordsman in Europe. On the other side stood Mademoiselle D'Eon. She was nearly 60. She was dressed in a voluminous black satin gown with petticoats that swept the floor. On her head she wore a lace bonnet. She looked like a grandmother prepared for a funeral, but in her hand she held a foil. The room was packed with the aristocracy of England, including the prince himself. They had come to see a freak show. They expected the young master to gently toy with the old lady. What they saw instead was a master class in violence. When the command to fence was given, the old lady vanished. Witnesses described D'Eon's transformation as instantaneous. Her stance widened, the black satin stretching tight. Her wrist, hardened by decades of drill, snapped the blade forward with terrifying speed. She did not fence like a woman of the court. She fenced like a dragoon captain fighting for his life in a German muddy field. Saint-Georges, to his credit, did not hold back, but he found himself on the defensive. D'Eon parried his thrusts with a strength that belied her age, her skirts swirling around her like a storm cloud. In the final exchange, D'Eon lunged, a perfect deep lunge that strained the seams of her corset, and landed a hit squarely on Saint-Georges' chest. The room erupted. The Prince of Wales cheered. Paintings were commissioned of the event. You can still see them today. The young man in white breeches recoiling from the old woman in the black dress. For D'Eon, it was a moment of supreme vindication. It was a message to the world. You may force me to wear this dress. You may call me Mademoiselle Bastille, but I am still the Chevalier. I am still dangerous. But triumphs in the fencing hall could not stop the tide of history. While D'Eon was parrying blades in London, France was collapsing. In 1789, the Bastille was stormed. The French Revolution had begun. For D'Eon, the revolution was a catastrophe. The monarchy that paid her pension was being dismantled. Her patrons were fleeing or being arrested. The checks from Versailles stopped coming. Suddenly, the celebrity found herself destitute. The grand house was gone. The servants were dismissed. She moved into a smaller shared apartment with a friend she had made in London, a widow named Mrs. Mary Cole. Mrs. Cole is the unsung hero of this story. She was a modest, pious Englishwoman who took pity on the eccentric French exile. She became D'Eon's nurse, companion, and shield against the world. And, crucially, she accepted D'Eon completely as a woman. To Mrs. Cole, D'Eon was simply an unfortunate noblewoman who had a masculine past. The two lived together in a state of genteel poverty, counting pennies to buy bread and tea. As the revolution turned bloody in 1792 and France declared war on Austria and Prussia, a bizarre spark of the old fire ignited in D'Eon's brain. She watched from afar as her homeland was invaded. She could not bear to sit idle. She wrote a letter to the National Assembly in Paris, the very revolutionaries who had overthrown her king. It is a letter that borders on the delusional, yet is heartbreaking in its sincerity. Mademoiselle d'Eon offered to return to France. She offered to raise a regiment of women, an Amazon legion, to fight for the Republic. She offered to lead them herself, sword in hand, against the enemies of France. "I wish to die as I have lived," she wrote, "fighting for my country." The revolutionaries in Paris read the letter and laughed. They dismissed it as the ramblings of a senile old woman. They did not know that the person writing it was a decorated cavalry officer who knew more about war than most of them combined. The rejection crushed d'Eon. She was trapped in England, trapped in poverty, and trapped in her gender. The dress, once a disguise, was now a straitjacket preventing her from fulfilling her duty. The final decade of d'Eon's life was a slow, agonizing slide into obscurity. To pay the rent, she began to sell off her most prized possessions. First went the jewelry, then the beloved collection of swords. Finally, in a moment that must have felt like cutting off a limb, she sold her library. d'Eon possessed one of the finest private collections of books in Europe, thousands of volumes on history, philosophy, and politics. She sold them at auction to pay the butcher and the baker. In 1796, tragedy struck again. During a fencing exhibition, she was still fighting in her late 60s to earn a few coins. A blade snapped and pierced her armpit, wounding her severely. She never fully recovered. The injury left her bedridden for months. The once agile fencer was now increasingly immobile. She grew fat, her body retaining water, her movements slow and painful. She became a recluse. The world moved on. Napoleon Bonaparte rose to power, reshaping Europe, but he had no use for a relic of the Ancien Régime. When d'Eon petitioned Napoleon for a pension, implying she could still be of use, the emperor reportedly shrugged and said the state had no money for historical curiosities. By 1804, d'Eon and Mrs. Cole were living in a grim apartment on New Millman Street. It was a dark, drafty place. d'Eon spent her days in a chair, reading the Bible and writing her memoirs. These writings are fascinating and chaotic. She writes of her piety, her virginity, and her suffering. She tries to rewrite her entire life as a moral fable, claiming she was born female and had been a victim of circumstances. She was writing the history she wanted the world to believe, cementing the mask to her face even as she approached the grave. There were moments of near discovery. Once, when d'Eon fell ill, a doctor came to examine her. d'Eon refused to let him touch her chest or abdomen, flying into a rage, claiming her female modesty was being violated. Mrs. Cole, respecting her friend's virtue, chased the doctor away, the secret held by a thread. As the year 1810 approached, d'Eon was 81 years old. She was in constant pain from what was likely prostate cancer or a similar ailment. A cruel irony for a woman to suffer from. She could barely move. Mrs. Cole tended to her with the devotion of a saint, feeding her, washing her face, and praying over her. In those final feverish nights, one wonders what went through the old spy's mind. Did he remember the frozen roads of Russia, the thunder of hooves at Villinghausen, the whisper of silk in the Hall of Mirrors? Or did he simply feel the weight of the lie he had carried for 33 years, a lie that had become his truth? On May 21st, 1810, the breathing stopped. The Chevalier d'Eon, the enigma of the 18th century, was dead. Mrs. Cole wept, believing she had lost her sister in Christ. She called for the undertaker and the doctor, expecting a routine preparation for burial. She did not know that the final act of the play was about to begin. The curtain had fallen, but the lights were about to be turned on, revealing the actor beneath the costume. The autopsy that followed would not just shock a room, it would challenge the definitions of gender and identity for centuries to come. May the 23rd, 1810. The room on New Millman Street was silent. The time for rumors was over. It was time for science. Gathered around the narrow bed were a handful of men whose expressions ranged from somber respect to burning curiosity. Among them was the surgeon Thomas Copeland, the Earl of Yarborough, and several French noblemen who had known the Mademoiselle in her final years. Mrs. Cole, the devoted companion, stood by the door, weeping into a handkerchief. She was mourning the loss of a gentle, pious old lady who had been her sister in poverty. She had no idea that she was about to witness the final shattering magic trick of the greatest spy of the century. Dr. Copeland approached the body. His task was to perform an autopsy to determine the cause of death, but also, and everyone in the room knew this was the true purpose, to settle the great question once and for all. For 33 years, the world had accepted Déon as a woman. The King of France had decreed it. The British courts had ruled on it. Déon herself had sworn it on the Bible. Copeland lifted the heavy woolen skirts. He untied the petticoats. He unlaced the corset that had constricted the Chevalier's torso for 3 decades. As the final layer of linen was removed, a gasp went through the room. It was a collective intake of breath that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the air. Mrs. Cole let out a cry of disbelief and collapsed into a chair, covering her eyes. Lying on the table was the body of a man. The anatomy was unambiguous. Dr. Copeland's official report, written in that very room, remains one of the most fascinating documents in medical history. He wrote with clinical precision, yet one can sense the shock between the lines. I hereby certify that I have inspected and dissected the body of the Chevalier Déon and have found the male organs of generation perfectly formed in every respect. However, the report also noted a strange duality that mirrored Déon's life. While the biological sex was male, the body had been shaped by 30 years of living as a woman. Copeland noted the unnatural roundness of the limbs, the softness of the skin, and a female configuration of fat distribution on the chest and hips. It was as if the mask had, over time, begun to reshape the face beneath it. The corset had molded the ribs. The sedentary life of a spinster had softened the muscles of the dragoon. The news exploded out of that small room and hit the streets of London like a bomb. The newspapers went wild. The Times, the Morning Chronicle, and the French press printed the autopsy report in full. For the public, the reaction was a mix of shock, hilarity, and anger. The old gamblers, the men who had bet thousands of pounds in the 1770s, were furious. Those who had bet on male and lost demanded their money back. Those who had bet on female felt swindled. The satirical cartoonists who had spent years drawing Déon as a grotesque old dame now drew him as a deceiver, laughing from beyond the grave. But for Mrs. Cole, the revelation was not a joke. It was a profound trauma. She had lived with Déon for years. They had shared meals, prayers, and the intimacy of a small home. She had nursed Déon through sickness. How had she not known? This is the true genius and the true tragedy of the Chevalier Déon. The discipline required to maintain the deception was inhuman. For decades, Déon had never once let the mask slip. He had bathed alone, dressed alone, and guarded his physical privacy with the ferocity of a wolf. He had sacrificed all romantic intimacy, all physical touch, and all honesty to maintain the role he had been assigned. He had lived and died in character. Déon was buried on May 28, 1810, in the churchyard of St. Pancras Old Church in London. In a final cruel twist of fate, the grave of the man who wanted to be remembered, was eventually lost. In the mid-19th century, the Midland Railway expanded, and the churchyard was dug up to make way for train tracks. The bones of the Chevalier d'Eon were scattered, lost in the anonymous earth of the city he had both charmed and deceived. But while the body vanished, the legacy did not. For a long time, history treated d'Eon as a curiosity, a footnote in the books of eccentrics. But as the 19th century turned into the 20th, a new science was born: sexology. In 1910, exactly 100 years after d'Eon's death, the pioneering psychologist Havelock Ellis was struggling to find a language to describe people who felt a disconnect between their biological sex and their internal identity. He looked back at the French spy and coined a term: eonism. For decades before the word transgender entered the lexicon, eonism was the medical term used to describe the desire to adopt the social role and attire of the opposite sex. The Chevalier, who had been mocked in life, became the eponym for a human experience that was finally being recognized. Today, we look at d'Eon through a modern lens, and the debate continues. Was d'Eon a transgender woman in an era that had no word for it? Was he a cisgender man who was forced into a role by a king and then trapped by poverty? Or was he gender fluid, someone who genuinely embraced both the sword and the fan? The evidence points to a complex truth. d'Eon did not just wear the dress, he defended it. In his memoirs, he wrote of the pain of being a man and the peace of being a woman. Even when the king was dead and the pension was gone, d'Eon never went back to being a man. He lived in poverty as a woman rather than return to the privileges of manhood. That speaks to something deeper than a mere spy's disguise. It speaks to an internal reality that was perhaps more true than the biology found on the autopsy table. In the end, the Chevalier d'Eon remains a Rorschach test for history. To the diplomat, he is a master of intrigue. To the soldier, he is a hero of the Dragoons. To the queer historian, he is a pioneer who carved out a space for gender variance in a rigidly binary world. In 1787, she is standing in the fencing hall at Carlton House. She is 60 years old, wearing 3 layers of heavy petticoats and a bonnet. Opposite her is the strongest fencer in Europe. The crowd is laughing. They see an old woman. But then the steel flashes. The wrist snaps. The old woman lunges with the speed of a viper and the strength of a soldier. The laughter dies in their throats. In that moment, d'Eon is neither man nor woman. d'Eon is simply excellence. d'Eon is a spirit that refuses to be categorized, boxed in, or defeated. The Chevalier d'Eon taught us that the clothes we wear, the names we are given, and the bodies we are born into are only the opening chapter of our story. The rest, the courage, the honor, the identity, is what we write ourselves. And sometimes, to write the truest story, you have to confuse the entire world.